This podcast contains explicit language.
Bafangu!
Houston, flight is go.
Mila, let's go.
From Assignment X, thesoniashow.com, and Amalgamated Storytelling, this is the Dorking Out Show, the podcast for people who love stories from movies, TV, books, podcasts, and everywhere else.
Welcome to episode 131 of Dorking Out. This is the Spy Who Loved Me, the Spy Who Loved #MeToo edition. My name is Sonia Mansfield, and joining me tonight are two very special guests. One is an accomplished nerd author, an award-winning filmmaker, and a leading dork thinker. He is Mark A. Altman, the author, along with Edward Gross of the fantastic new book, So Say We All, the complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of Battlestar Galactica. And the other guest is my occasional co-host and complete flake, Chris Smith, whose accomplishments totally escape me. I don't even remember what your accomplishments are, Smith.
They don't amount to much.
Yes. Mark is also the host of a fantastic new podcast called The 430 Movie, which does like deep dives into all kinds of movie culture. And we're going to talk about that too, because I am into that stuff.
I'm just amazed you've done 131 of these. That's pretty impressive.
Well, if you listen to them, it becomes much less impressive.
Well, I mean, I guess also if you think Supernatural's done 300 episodes, so you got a ways to catch them.
That's true. Well, yeah, Star Trek's, what are they? They're in the 750s now? So
something
yeah.
like that, yeah. I don't know if I count all of them as Star Trek, though.
That's true. Oh, what did you say? All right. We come tonight to talk a bit about Mark's Battlestar Galactica book. We do plan to have on. That's right. We have several sound changes for tonight's podcast, all of which, if you have your Dorking Out bingo cards, you got my crickets, you got weird microphones, have fun at home. We do plan to have Ed Gross on to do a deep dive on the BSG book.
Yeah, but most people don't know Ed and I don't talk to each other, that we had a falling out, and so we won't go on the air together. So
That's right.
No, that's not true at all.
Yeah. But
are you guys just sick of each other after writing the book? That's what it is.
Well, speaking for myself, I am. But no. Ed actually has been very busy with some things, and he was actually he had a little health scare, and so he's been he wasn't able to join us. And plus, also with the time, we're on the East Coast, it's fairly late, and
Exactly.
he's not a late body. So
yeah.
you get two for the price of one. You'll get Ed in a couple of weeks, and I'm sure he'll be delightful and entertaining and wonderful, as Ed often is.
Yes, he is. He is fantastic, and we were looking forward to that. But I am looking forward to this because I'm not even sure I have words anymore to describe what kind of fan I am of the books that Mark and Ed write.
Ed Gross.
Ed Gross.
In case you forgot his name.
That's
Ed
right.
Gross.
The Star Trek books, I've said back and forth all over Twitter and everywhere that anyone will listen to me, I think are the best books ever written on Star Trek. And given the forests of trees that have been felled by Star Trek books, I think that's an impressive thing. I was ridiculously honored to be put on the back cover of the new Battlestar Galactica book, and Mark and Ed's play to get back on this podcast was successful by kissing up to me.
That was the plan.
That's right.
That's one of my favorite quotes about any of the books we've written. Your blurb about, and it really encapsulates what we were setting out to do on the Star Trek book. So I was so thrilled that it made the blurb, the back cover of the Galactica book.
Yeah.
I mean, we had a lot of great reviews, and there's so many we couldn't include, but the whole comparing it to OJ Made in America class achievement, because that's what we really wanted to do, was not just deal with it as a pop culture phenomena and making up, but also socially and politically and
right.
critically and not just then I went to the bridge and we lit the model and we shot it this way, and it's like it's a much more complex, interesting story to be told. So you got that,
Definitely.
which is awesome.
Yeah,
it wasn't one of these reviews like, well, how come the actors aren't interviewed more?
Well, you know what? That might be the thing I like most about it.
Please stop saying nice things to Smith. He's going to start expecting it all the time.
That's true.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, what's interesting, and one of the reasons I mentioned that, one, is to shamelessly brag about the fact that I am very proud to be on the back of that book. But two, when I heard about your next book that is, we're not going to get too much into it here, but it does connect up with tonight's subject, I had a very strange feeling because Star Trek and Star Wars are my two biggest pop culture loves. We got plenty of Star Wars books. You guys write these pair of Star Trek books that are insanely good. My favorite show of 2000 to 2010 is Battlestar Galactica. You write that. My other oldest love in pop culture is James Bond. And so I was ecstatic to learn that you guys are doing an oral history of Bond. We're not going to kind of spoil too much here. We're not going to really get into it or talk about it too much. But the fact that you guys have your finger on my pulse, it's almost like you guys have my house bugged.
Get out of my head. Yeah,
Pretty much.
I'm in the process of reliving my entire childhood. It's like Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica and Bond and God, who knows? Maybe I'll have to do Star Wars. A hit for the cycle.
Oh my God! That's the thing. Is if you did Star Wars,
please do that.
That's right.
Please do it.
Star Wars would be a challenge, but I keep saying, and I've said this before. It's like Michael Corleone in Godfather 3. I keep trying to get out, but they pulled me back in. And, I thought the Star Trek was a one-off, and then it became 2 books, and then and then we did Buffy, which is also a terrific book, Slayers and Vampires, and then I said I was done, and then we did Galactica, and I said I was absolutely done, and then. The James Bond thing came up. I said, well, I have to do that.
You have to.
I don't know, what's next or if I can be dragged into it. Ed will be writing these things until the day he dies. For me, it's kind of, I'm just, I've had a great time doing them with Ed, and I'm really gratified by the response they've gotten. And, it's been fantastic. I mean, for me, it's also, getting to reconnect with these shows I haven't thought about in a long time. I mean, I love, in the Galactica book, we do this chapter on Galactica 1980. And, I've told this story before, but when we finished the manuscript, I read that, the book through, and I, said about the Galactica 1980 chapter, I said, no one's ever going to cover this crappy show again. And I don't have anything here I haven't read 100 times or the 12 times it's been covered.
Right.
And I think that I need to start over and do it again and do it better. And I said, because, if no one else is ever going to do it, so I have to do it well. And so I went back and rewrote it from the first, word and interviewed a whole bunch more people. And it's like one of my favorite chapters in any of the books we ever did, just because it's such a crazy disaster of a show that's misguided in almost every way. But that's, makes the story that much more interesting.
Well, yeah, I have to admit, I am a huge audiobook listener. So I have not gotten through this book as quickly as
you actually have to read words.
Exactly. I actually have to stop. I have to sit down. I got to read words. I can't do it in the car while I'm driving.
Smith has been working on his novel forever, yet refuses to sit down and actually read other people's books.
Well, I don't know why there's not an audiobook. And there was a wonderful audiobook on the Trek books, and there was a wonderful audiobook on the Buffy book. And I keep looking, and I can't get a straight answer from the publisher, so I don't know what's going on with that. But I sure hope and would expect that there would be an audiobook, and I think it would be delightful. But until then, people are going to have to do it the old-fashioned way on Kindle or buy the actual hardcover book.
I'll do it. Which I have. Yeah, it's funny because I've been purporting to be writing this novel for God knows how long, and I know for a fact that Mark and Ed have written 4 massive books in the time that I was supposed to write my stupid book. So, sweet Christmas. But enough about my ego and my unfinished book. We
and
come
your quote.
tonight.
Yes, and your quote. I'm waiting for Sonia to say something nice so we can put her on the book.
Keep waiting, Mark.
Oh, my God.
Just...
So speaking of things that Sonia may or may not say nice things about, The Spy Who Loved Me. We
Yes,
are
I've
here
heard of it.
to talk about
1977, the second greatest movie of the third greatest movie of 1977.
what's the second.
Well, the first is Annie Hall, the second is Star Wars, and the third is Spy Who Loved Me.
All right, I might quibble with that ranking, but not for tonight. But
Well, you know what won Best Picture in 1977? Yeah, sure. When I was 10, I was
true.
upset, but now, I mean, it's clearly Annie Hall is the greatest movie of 1977. But Star Wars is a close second, and
Right.
Spy Who Loved Me is coming up in third position, and Damnation Alley is probably 97th.
okay, that's right.
Wait. Didn't Close Encounters come out that year too?
So
I
that
think it
would
might
be
have been.
with slide in and as number
Yeah.
4.
All right, so
And I love Close Encounters, but Spy Who Loved Me is my favorite Roger Moore James Bond movie, so I'm not going to diss it.
I agree with you, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about The Spy Who Loved Me is because
How did we end up talking about Spy Who Loved Me? Why did you even call me for this?
well, one because I knew I thought I heard somewhere that this was your favorite Roger Moore James
Oh,
Bond
it is.
movies.
And it absolutely is. It's just such a weird thing. Let's talk about Spy Who Loved Me. There's no anniversary. It's not like it's
Right.
what's it tied into?
Well,
I mean, I'm just curious.
I'll be honest, and you probably have picked up on this by now. I like to torture Sonia sometimes, and she has a
Ah,
famous, probably aversion to Roger Moore James Bond movies.
oh, so she's sensitive about some things? Yes.
She's sensitive about this, so I said, I know, let's make her watch a Roger Moore James Bond movie.
I think that's not fair, what you're saying. That's not entirely accurate.
No, of course it's not fair. When have I been fair?
I will tell you, in the Galactica book, I was very defensive about people that bashed on 1978 Galactica because I love that. Obviously the 2004 Galactica is a masterpiece, but the 1978 series gets dissed, sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of sci-fi. I feel the same way about Roger Moore. I don't suffer the slings and arrows against Roger Moore because you look, obviously, I mean, Sean Connery is my favorite Bond. I love Daniel Craig, but
Right.
I feel Roger Moore, his more debonair take on the gentleman agent with a license to kill and thrill is as germane and delightful, and the Etonian, more sophisticated kind of guy, Noel Coward, who walks through danger, is I love it, and it's like I'm like in our toxic fan culture where everything has to be pitted against each other, like in a
Right.
gladiatorial arena. Like, you can't like Star Wars if you like Star Trek or all this other shit. It's like, I love Sean Connery and I love Roger Moore, and that's just the way it is.
Amen, brother. But the other reason I wanted to talk about this is you're doing an awful lot of research, and anybody that wants to see some fantastic old-timey James Bond pictures and paraphernalia, check out Mark's Twitter account, because he is tweeting out all kinds of crazy old publicity stuff and whatever. I don't think people really understand that if it wasn't for The Spy Who Loved Me, specifically this movie, we're used to being in a world where there's always probably going to be a James Bond book or movie. After Pierce Brosnan did Die Another Day, which I was not a fan of in any way, I think people still assumed, well, eventually they'll get around to doing something. But back in the 60s and 70s, the typical way of doing this was you have a movie series, you make as many as you can until it runs out, and then when it runs out, it's done, it's dead, it's gone. And correct me if I'm wrong, and why don't you get into this? Roger Moore's first two movies, especially Man with the Golden Gun, his second movie, didn't set the house on fire.
Well, let's put things in context. Here's the thing. So when the James Bond franchise started, you had, people can't really understand this now, but you had a movie a year. So you had Dr. No come out. Then the next year was From Russia with Love. Then the next year was Goldfinger. So there weren't these 2-year hiatuses until the movie started getting really big. You start to get, the Thunderball, the You Only Live Twice. And, so it starts. You see why Connery was so burned out. I mean, it wasn't these 19-year hiatuses like Daniel Craig has between movies. So, basically, so when Roger Moore takes over the franchise with Live and Let Die, Live and Let Die did very well. Live and Let Die did better than Diamonds Are Forever. So,
okay.
Live and Let Die did well. The problem comes with the Man with the Golden Gun. Man with the Golden Gun underperformed. It was a time of great turmoil in the relationship between Harry Saltzman and Albert Broccoli, which eventually led to Saltzman leaving, the two producers of the Bond movie since the beginning, UA buying out Harry Saltzman, which created, a lot of stuff. And look, Man with the Golden Gun is the first James Bond movie I ever saw in a theater, which doesn't mean, it's funny because at the same time that my lifelong devotion to Bond, I also consider probably the worst Bond movie. It's an awful movie, but at the time I loved it. It was my gateway drug. It looks cheap. It is a pastiche of things done better in other movies. And so there really was a sense that it was the battle for the Planet of the Apes of the Bond franchise, that it was running out of gas, that maybe this thing had, no one expected this thing to go on forever. But what Cubby Broccoli does in 1977 is he sort of doubles down. Rather than these other franchises where it became the law of diminishing returns and they'd spend less and less until a franchise finally died a long, lingering death, he says, we're going to put more money into it. It's going to be bigger. It's going to be better. It's going to be Bond and beyond. And that's the great thing about Spy Who Loved Me. It doubles down on Bond and just does a bigger and more epic. And it just in every way it really defines the Roger Moore era of the 70s, for better or worse, because it finds this great balance between witty and urbane and silly, which obviously goes too far in the next movie with Moonraker. But right. Spy Who Loved Me, look, Spy Who Loved Me is clearly You Only Live Twice. Underwater, instead of in space, but right. but it's just such a wonderful film with so many great conceits. A lot of people don't realize that Tom Mankiewicz, who had done Diamonds Are Forever and Live and Let Die, and then came back and did a little work on Golden Gun, but he really did a page one rewrite on so many different people who worked on Spy Who Loved Me. It's fascinating. I mean, Anthony Burgess, who did Clockwork Orange, was on it for a while. John Landis was on it for a while. As a writer, he has great stories about working on Spy Who Loved Me. You have obviously Richard Maybaum worked on it. The Bond screenwriter who worked on more Bond movies than anybody until Purvis and Wade, and then the list just goes on. There's so many people. Carrie Bates, the comic book writer. I mean, there were just so many people that worked on it. But then Tom Mankiewicz came and sort of made sense of the whole thing, and sort of makes it work. And he was the great guy in terms of creating, wit and double entendres, and he's so good. Maybaum was a great constructionalist, but Mankiewicz had great dialogue, and the two of them, and then Chris Wood comes in, who was Lewis Gilbert's guy, right. Who sort of brings the whole thing home. And then, and he also is an interesting guy. I mean, he's sort of saddled with the reputation of being the single card credit on Moonraker. So people have a lot of, disrespect for Chris Wood. But I think Chris Wood also brought some really interesting aspects to it. But Spy Who Loved Me just does so many things right. And, it sets the tone with that brilliant pre-title sequence where, he jumps off the mountain, and the parachute comes out, and the Union Jack, and then you sort of go into this beautiful song by
Carly Simon.
Carly Simon, yeah, Carly Simon's "Nobody Does It Better," which is just so great, that Marvin Hamlish wrote with singer. And it's just great because you have the globetrotting that made Bond great. You're in Egypt. You have this beautiful Maurice Binder credit sequence. It's probably his greatest opening credit sequence since Thunderball, and I don't think it's ever topped after that. I mean, and it's so funny because literally I think it was. I forget who told me this, but they said, yeah. So how does Maurice Binder try and illustrate the Spy Who Loved Me in a credit sequence? He puts, the Russian in the hat, the girl in the hat. So, look, the spy, she's the spy in the Russian. Right. And but it's just so wonderful because you're just and even at the time, the jet ski is this really novel concept because there wasn't really jet skis. So when Bond is jet skiing to Atlantis, that's a pretty neat gadget. And of course, the submarine car, especially at a certain age, was the greatest thing since the DB5. I mean, as a kid, I had the Corgi, submarine car and just freaking adored that thing. And it's such a great scene because, now everybody knows the submarine car, but when you're seeing Spy Who Loved Me for the first time and the car is going off the pier and you're like, oh my God, they're going in the water. And then suddenly it becomes a submarine car.
Yes. Yeah, I remember seeing that. I saw The Spy Who Loved Me on the ABC Sunday night movie. And when that car drives off, and then it's like, oh my God, he's gonna drown. They're gonna get out. But then he just presses his button. He's super suave, turns into a submarine. It's like, and I think that's one of the reasons I'm drawn to this movie and kind of want to talk about it because it's The Spy Who Loved Me is almost the most James Bond movie of all the James Bonds. Okay, well, actually, Sonia, why don't you talk a little bit about it?
Well, I was just going to say, it ticks all those boxes, right? It's got, like, the really good villain. It's got a really good henchman. It's got the exotic locations. It's got this really cool Bond girl. It's got the good gadgets, the car, the theme song. It has, like, all those things that you want in a Bond movie.
Yeah, no, it is Roger Moore's Goldfinger in a way, right. And the thing is, I mean, obviously it would have been better if it had been Blofeld than Stromberg, which it was supposed to be. In most of the drafts it was, but then the litigation with Gloria heated up and they changed it to Stromberg and gave him the webbed hands, which on TV you don't really notice, but if you see it on the screen, you would, oh my God, he has webbed hands. How silly is that?
Right.
And it's Kurt Jurgens from The Enemy Below, which is sort of fun casting, and Jaws, which of course is one of the great henchmen since Odd Job. Look, the Marvin Hamlish score is not great, and I mean he channels the Bee Gees. That cue at the beginning, Bond 77. It's definitely a product. I mean, imagine had John Barry scored it, how much better that would have been. But then we probably wouldn't have ended up with Nobody Does It Better as the title song, because of course that was a relationship. Marvin Hamlish ended up marrying the lyricist, the songwriter, Carol Bader Singer. So so we should be grateful. Plus, there are a couple of tracks on that I really like. I mean, I like the tanker where the La Paris opens up and so swallows the submarines and everything. And then it's Ken Adams, just a tour de force for him. The tanker set.
Oh yeah.
The Atlantis, all that stuff that he builds. I mean, it's just
I loved Atlantis.
production.
I thought that was so cool.
It's awesome. It's like a Captain Nemo.
So cool.
Yeah, no, totally. And so the movie does so much right. It uses Q really well. Desmond Llewellyn's great in it. I love the scene where you see Bond in his naval uniform. It's a short little scene, but it's just very cool.
Right.
And obviously Barbara Bach is Major Massiva. Originally they wanted Catherine Deneuve for it, but she wanted too much money, who would have been amazing. But Barbara Bach is fantastic. I mean, she's everything a 70s Bond girl should be. And she's just terrific. So
I love how they introduced her in the movie, how you think they're talking about the man, right?
Oh, it's great. It's great. Yeah, you think Agent XXX, and you think it's going to be him, and then it turns out she's the super agent, she's the kick-ass, KGB, awesome super agent for the Soviets, and he's just some nobody who gets shot in the teaser, which is great. And you know who that is? That's Michael Billington. Michael Billington was the sort of also-ran of Bonds. He was up to play James Bond. Every time somebody made noise about quitting through the 70s and early 80s, he was like the also-ran who they would have put under contract and had screen tested, who almost became Bond a bunch of times. And Jane Seymour tells this great story when she was doing the Oneiden line, how she was doing it with Michael Billington, and he was like, I'm going to be the next James Bond. I'm going to be the next. And then when she got cast in Live and Let Die, like he couldn't believe it. He was like shocked. He was like, how could she be in a Bond movie before me? And of course he ended up never becoming James Bond. But and it's sort of a thankless a role that he has, getting sort of shot at the beginning. But even that, the way that pays off, when this mission is over, I shall kill you. It's like, oh, it's awesome.
Right. Actually, I want to divert something for a moment here that I've heard something all my life, and I think you are the best person I'm ever going to talk to for answering this question. Burt Reynolds passed away a few weeks ago, which is sad. And at the time, there was all this talk about, Burt Reynolds was going to be James Bond, but he turned it down. Is that true? Because I cannot imagine any, James Bond is a point of pride for Britain. I can't imagine the producers.
There is some truth to it, and there is also something apocryphal. Right. Here's the thing: he did not turn it down. However, they were in discussions about it, and United Artists really wanted him. This was after the failure of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And Sean Connery did Diamonds Are Forever, and he was clear he wasn't coming back. And United Artists was really worried about keeping the franchise going. The hottest thing going was Burt Reynolds, so the studio wanted Burt Reynolds. And ultimately, even though they had some preliminary conversations, Cubby Broccoli said no, Bond has to be British. He put his foot down. We're not casting an American, and thank God, because that probably would have killed the franchise. Just like when they talked about John Gavin. John Gavin, was literally under contract. And thank God, Sean Connery ended up doing Diamonds Are Forever, because we could have ended up with John Gavin, who was Sam Loomis from Psycho, who would have been, super awful.
Wow. That I got to stop. I got to sit down and think about that. But while I do that, Sonia. Mm-hmm. So we've had a long-running kind of joke on this podcast about your not love, let's just call it, for Roger Moore and Roger Moore's quote-unquote rapiness. What is what do you think of this movie? Like how
he's no Brett Kavanaugh, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, he is no Brett Kavanaugh. That is a fact. All right, here's where the I don't like using the word rapey. Maybe I have used that word in the past, but that's not quite what I mean. Roger Moore isn't really like my favorite Bond, because he always felt like maybe he was too old for the part.
Right.
And they always pair him up with women who are considerably younger.
Sure.
So it's kind of a lecherous vibe that was kind of a turnoff for me. So some of the movies aren't my favorite, but those are the ones that were on TBS all the time back in the day on the Bond station.
Okay.
Was For Your Eyes Only and A View to Kill and Octopussy and all of those. So those are the ones I watched all the time, and it just kind of gave me this dirty grandpa vibe that I don't super love.
I can see that, but
A View to a Kill will do that.
Look, A View to a Kill, where Stacey Sutton is Tanya Roberts, and he's obviously too old. It's one film too many for him. So look, I agree, but in none of these cases, you could say it's problematic in terms of kind of wish fulfillment for guys. But the thing is, when he's not forcing himself on it, it's just silly. Yeah. That she's throwing himself at Roger Moore. At the same time, it's ridiculous that she's a respected geologist, because she comes across as complete insane. But I think that when you look at Lois Chiles and Moonraker, it's a very competitive relationship, and that's more age appropriate at that point. Right. For Your Eyes Only. Again, he's not throwing himself at Melina Havelock. She's really focused on revenge. And by the end, they've had this near-death experience, and they sort of, end up in bed together. But again, he's not being I think, really you could make the case that Connery is a lot more quote unquote rapey than Moore, because even, you have the character of the figure skater, Lynn Holly Johnson, who he keeps at arm's length, who she's throwing herself at him, and he's like, won't have anything to do. He says, go get yourself a lollipop or whatever he says. Right. And then, in Octopussy, again, you have someone who is fairly age appropriate in terms of the Maud Adams relationship, and that works really well. Now, you have the incidental women and stuff, but I know a lot has been made out of the whole how is James Bond going to evolve with the times, and I don't really feel that the Bond films need to evolve because this is the character. I mean, nobody's holding him up as a role model.
Right.
Bond is a screwed up guy who kills for a living, who's an assassin, who obviously is a very damaged person. So the idea of sort of trying to turn Bond into, I think we have to look at ourselves as men who say, oh, he was our role model. We grew up wanting to be James Bond. That's where the questionableness.
I'm like, that's on you.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Not in terms of the depiction of this character. Right. So I think it's something a lot of people are talking about. I would hate to see the Bond movies change dramatically from what they are, because that's Fleming, and that's Bond. And by depicting something doesn't mean you're condoning it, is just sort of how I feel about it.
I think that the Daniel Craig Bonds actually do a really good job of showing that he isn't a role model.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure. And I will say, like, in The Spy Who Loved Me, I actually felt better about this. This was the most I've enjoyed watching this movie. I had a really good time watching it, and I was like, oh, this is really fun. This is better than I remember it. And I actually kind of like their relationship because they're on, like, a parallel path.
Yes.
Like, she's the female Bond. She's equal to him, and so
she's the female Bond, exactly. She's atomic blonde or atomic red, atomic Soviet.
And ultimately, like, they're not going to be together. They work for, like, competing companies, if you will. So they're not going to stay together, but, like, so they have that in common. They live that kind of life.
But what's great, and I wish they had done it, but Barbara Bach didn't want to do it. You may not remember this, but in A View to a Kill, there's a scene where Bond goes into a hot tub in San Francisco with this blonde Soviet agent because they're trying to get this information about Max Zorin, Christopher Walken, and they wanted Barbara Bach to do a cameo as Major Amousova on that scene, which would have been awesome. But she didn't want to do it because, of course, she's married to Ringo Starr and has sort of disowned the Bond movies. And it's such a shame because that would have been awesome. That would have been a great cameo.
Yeah.
It would have elevated that movie from a half a star to at least three-quarters of a star.
Well, you know what? Here's the thing is I one of the shows that I listen to a lot is the James Bonding podcast.
I love that podcast. Yeah.
Right. And they have gone to bat, and I think they have made me really love both Moonraker and A View to a Kill because they're so just batshit crazy. They're so weird and nuts.
Part of the reason I ended up doing my own podcast was because I just fell in love with the James Bonding podcast, which doesn't mean I condone their opinions because I think their opinions are insane. But I was talking to Matt Gorley about it recently, who I find delightful. Right. And, he's very defensive about A View to Kill. And partially that's because it was such a big part of his childhood. They say your favorite Bond is the one you grew up on usually. Right. And, so a lot of people of a certain age love A View to a Kill. Now, I can't fathom loving A View to a Kill. I mean, I remember going to the press screening in New York, and I was so excited because, it was a new Bond movie and everything. And it was like, oh, my God, this movie is horrible. And, to this day, I think it's horrible. Although, I watched it recently and I can enjoy it, but still realize it's a horrible movie. So it's hysterical to listen to them talk about A View to Kill as though it's anything but awful. Whereas Moonraker to me is, if you accept the fact that this is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? It's absurd and ridiculous. It is one of the most enjoyable, most fun, most raucous Bond films. Yes, of course it's ridiculous, and if you're comparing it to From Russia with Love, it's idiotic. Right. But it has some of the best scenes in any Bond movie. I mean, I love when Drax turns to his henchman Chang and says, find Mr. Bond, see that some harm comes to him, and Lonsdale is so great. And then you have, the scene in the centrifugal astronaut thing. And then, but one of my favorite scenes of any of the Bond movies is the scene where Bond is leaving the Drax estate and there's an assassin up in the tree that's supposed to kill Bond, and they're hunting pheasant. They're shooting pheasant. And he says, Mr. Bond, why don't you take a try? And this guy's about to assassinate Bond, and he misses the pheasant. And he goes, you missed, Mr. Bond. And then Moore says, did I? And then the guy falls out of the tree. And it's just so great. And then he leaves, and Corinne Clary, who showed him the safe, is Corinne Dufour, he fires her. And then she starts to leave, and he sends the Dobermans after her, and it's this great marriage of this gorgeous Claude Lelouch photography and the John Barry score and his slow motion of her running and suddenly the freaking Dobermans jump on her and then you dissolve to, I think it's Venice at that point. Right. It's just so great. So there's so much in Moonraker, and the special effects are phenomenal. Derek Mennings, it's his best miniature work, and the stuff on the space station, again, it's like 1979. It's 3 years after Star Wars. No, 2 years after Star Wars. Right. And it's just super entertaining and fun, and you just got to be in that mindset to enjoy it. But people hate it. And then you have things like the double take, the double take pigeon, which is, sort of a shorthand for Bond film stupidity.
Well, exactly. And I think that's the thing is, when I was growing up, the first movie I saw was Thunderball, so Connery was my guy, and I liked some of Roger Moore's movies, but some of them I just thought were embarrassing. I remember not liking A View to a Kill. I remember really hating Moonraker, but I think that's one of the reasons I love the James Bonding podcast, is because they kind of set my way of thinking about these movies, which I think is kind of what you echoed, is if you can accept the craziness of them, they become these totally different things. And I think that's also one of the things that puts my finger on my problem with Pierce Brosnan is they're not crazy enough to be fun, and they're not good enough to be kind of hard and dramatic.
Yeah,
so
the problem with Pierce,
weird no man's land that is
the problem.
Just
yeah, I get that. I mean, the problem with Pierce is not Pierce's scripts. I think most people would agree that Pierce was a really good synthesis of Sean Connery and Roger Moore, but he was let down by his scripts. In Goldeneye, where you have sort of 3/4 of a really good script is 3/4 of a really good movie. Yeah. And then you have Tomorrow Never Dies, which is a travesty of a mockery of a sham of a travesty, and then you have A World Is Not Enough, which is fine in some ways and not fine in others, and then that again is your you have the problem with the girl. You have Denise Richards as the nuclear scientist, which is just awful
Christmas
casting.
Jones.
Yeah, in cutoffs.
It was. Yeah. And God, I can only imagine what it would have been like to have that character in a Roger Moore Bond movie. That would have been. I guess that's the thing. Is that kind of level of ridiculousness never really takes off. I mean, the only Bond movie that I covered as a journalist was The World Is Not Enough. Yeah, The World Is Not Enough. Right. And that's one of my problems with Pierce Brosnan is, for the life of me, I cannot remember his first two movies, his middle two movies. Die Another Day is just awful in a million different ways, so that is burned into my head. Goldeneye is his first one. And, I covered one of them, but the other two I just cannot...
But Die Another Day to me is his Moonraker, although the problem with Die Another Day, it's a completely schizophrenic film, because I will argue that the first hour of Die Another Day is quite good. Mm-hmm. But when he says, I'd like to show you a little scientific demonstration in Iceland, after that, the movie is just awful, and it never comes back from that. You got that horrible CGI parasailing thing, and the late 1990 speed ramps and all this other stuff that dates it, and it's just awful. But the stuff in Cuba is really good. The stuff in North Korea is really good at the beginning. I mean, there's a lot I like in that. And the sword fight is fantastic at the club in England. But the rest of the movie is just heinous. But I would argue that if you look at Pierce, his best James Bond films are The Tailor of Panama and Thomas Crown Affair, which he's phenomenal in. Yeah. And neither of them are James Bond movies, but they feel like James Bond movies, and they're so good. Especially Thomas Crown Affair. Mm-hmm. And if he'd only had decent scripts to work with, it's just he got the short end of the stick, and I feel bad for Pierce, because he wanted it so bad, and then he got it with Living Daylights, and then he had the rug pulled out from under him when they picked up Remington Steele, and he got let go, and then Timothy Dalton got brought in, and it's so sad, because then he finally gets Bond. He does the Martin Campbell one, Goldeneye, which is pretty good, and then it's just downhill from there, and it's really such a shame, because like I said, I thought it was the best of he took part of Sean Connery, part of Roger Moore. He synthesized the previous Bonds in a really interesting way, and just never really amounted to anything.
How much George Lazenby is in there?
There's no George Lazenby in there. You know, it's interesting. It's funny because I was thinking that when I was saying that. It's funny you say that. You know, I just saw on Her Majesty's Secret Service again on the big screen, and George Lazenby introduced it. And, you know,
I just watched it again the other night because now my husband and I are on this James Bond kick where we're going to start working our way through the movies, I think. So we start on Her Majesty's Secret Service is the one I haven't seen the most. Like, I haven't seen it that much. It was never on TV. Yeah, I think because it's so
Sunday
long.
Night Movie,
yeah, because it was really long.
Fridays. You know, it was like they banished it to Fridays. It didn't even make the ABC Sunday Night Movie. You didn't even get Ernie Anderson say Sean Connery and the one that started it all, Dr. No. But you know, it's like it is the bastard of all of the franchise. But you know, look, it's a gorgeous looking movie. Michael Reed, beautifully directed. Lens by Michael Reed, beautifully directed by Peter Hunt. You know, and Lazenby, there's a lot about Lazenby that's great, but you know, he's just not an actor. And you know, his fight scenes terrific, and you know, his cockiness and his arrogance, you know, all comes through. I mean, because that's the way he is. But you know, he just wasn't trained as an actor, and you know, other people said, you know, you can wear Sean Connery's suits and have his hairstyle, but that doesn't make you Sean Connery. And
it just loses you. Like in the first 5 minutes where he breaks the fourth wall and he's like, this never happened to the other fellow. I'm like, what? Who's he talking to?
Yeah. As funny as that joke is, I mean, it really does. It's too meta. And it just really takes you out of the movie in the same way. You know, look, what's the worst line in the history of the Bond movies? In Fear Eyes Only, when they drop Blofeld down the chimney, he says, you know, put me down, I'll buy you a delicatessen in stainless steel. It's like, oh my God, talk about just absolutely destroying any tension and any suspense for a really bad joke that's not even funny.
Yeah, but actually, you know what? Now that I think about it, this is a nice little tease to your 4:30 movie podcast, because I was actually on a plane flying back to Chicago, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, you guys told the story of the weird ABC television cut of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where they created some narration. They kind of essentially recut the movie and created some narration for On Her Majesty's Secret Service that only played on the ABC, I guess, Friday night movie or whatever.
Yeah, because the premise of the 4:30 movie is that it's an homage to the classic 4:30 movie of our youth, where, you know, you'd watch all these movies on TV and they'd be like Planet of the Apes week and Sci-Fi week and all this Monster week. And so we curate these fantasy theme weeks. So we did James Bond week, and when we're talking about Our Majesty's Secret Service, we talked about when it premiered on ABC. You know, so the ABC had no idea what to do with it because it was the least successful of the Bond movies, and it didn't have, you know, an actor they could promote or anything. So, and they're concerned that the movie starts really slow. So they created, the first time they aired it, what I call the Frankenstein cut, which it aired over 2 nights because it's a really long movie. But it starts in the middle of the movie, and they got some actor, not George Lazenby, to narrate it as though he's Bond. And so it starts already in Switzerland, and then it flashes back like some really bad film noir to the beginning of the movie eventually, and so it's a re-edit. You know, there's no new footage, but it's completely re-edited so that it's nonlinear, and it's crazy. It's crazy, and it was just like how they were able to get away with that. And, you know, it certainly doesn't improve the movie. It just makes it more confusing. And then to use a guy who's not even George Lazenby to do the ADR. I mean, I said it's the opposite of the Blade Runner cut, where they took the narration out. It's like they took the movie and added the narration. And it's just, this is the kind of crazy stuff that, you know, network TV, broadcast TV did in the 70s. Now you could never imagine such a thing. But that was, you know, I mean, it's also like when you would play Planet of the Apes over 2 nights, you know, in a 90-minute time slot. And what you would do is you'd show the first half, and the next day you would start at 20 minutes, repeat 20 minutes of the movie that you had already seen, just so it would fit the second night. I mean, it was just like how they got away with it. We were so, you know, before streaming and before VHS and before
they had no competition.
Put up with all this nonsense, but it was crazy.
How did it play when you saw it at the screening? Like, did the audience love it?
Oh, they loved it. I mean, it didn't hurt that George Lazenby introduced it, so everybody,
Sure.
you know, and I think it was for the most part, you know, diehard Bond people, but then there were some people who had never seen it. You know, it's always an interesting mixture, and I think it played it really well. It got some big laughs, a lot of applause. I mean, it really played well, and you know, it's definitely a very cinematic movie, and of course, you know, it has that really powerful final scene, you know, that scene of the movie, which, you know, he's good in, and
Right.
is a really, you know, and Diana Rigg, of course, is one of the great Bond girls of all time.
Right. It kills me. It kills me. Every time I watch that movie, I really do like it. But if they had somehow gotten Connery into that script with that team at that moment.
But here's my question for you, because I've always said that too, and I've started to rethink that because other people have said, they say, here's the thing. Do you really think that Sean Connery at that stage could play that kind of vulnerability? Would you really believe Sean Connery falling in love with this woman, giving everything up for love, and then, you know, basically, you know, Blofeld killing her at the end and him like crying over the dead body? I'm not sure that Sean Connery, you know, at that stage in his career, you know, and the way he was identified as Bond coming off You Only Live Twice.
Right.
I don't know if it would have worked.
Well,
I don't know.
Here's the thing. I agree with you 100%. You might be right. But one of the things that's so great about movies and actors and all that stuff is sometimes they can surprise you. Sometimes you can ask them to do something that you don't think that they could do.
But it's
then
not Sean Connery.
That they could do.
Because Sean Connery, obviously, as we know now,
Right.
was a great actor. Look at him in The Untouchables. Look at him in, you know, things from the Russia House. Look at, you know, just his career is, you know, he's a really great actor.
Right.
The question is not could he have acted it, but that in that iconic character of Bond, could he have stripped away all the artifice and done that? And then, you know, coming off You Only Live Twice with the exploding volcanoes and Blofeld and to suddenly then have this small movie where, you know, he's helps this girl in distress and ends up eventually falling in love with her and you know, feel like, you know, and then also, you know, for half the movie he's pretending to be this, you know, gay professor.
Oh,
you know,
that's true.
This mincing guy, and I just don't see, you know, Sean Connery doing that. It's like you definitely make these movies in your mind. It's like, what if, you know, it's like, you see, what if Sean Connery and Her Majesty's Secrets, you know, maybe one day with virtual reality and technology we'll be able to do so. Yeah, but I just can't, you know, it's like it always sounds great to say that. It's like, my God, if only Sean Connery had played Bond, it would be the greatest Bond of all time. But then you start to really break it down. It's like, would it?
Maybe, you know, and that's the thing that's so infuriating about it, because it seems like it would. It seems like that greatest Bond movie of all time is right there, but we're never going to get to see it. It's never going to happen. So it's just, you know, it's like,
who's been great in this? I've never thought of this before. I've never said this. Timothy Dalton would have been great in Our Majesty's Secret Service. Like, if we were just doing the fantasy casting of Our Majesty's Secrets, like, what actor could have really nailed that? And I'm not a huge Dalton fan at all. Yeah. And yet I think Dalton could have nailed that. Like, I would have believed that he really fell in love with her and was willing to throw it all away.
He does have that sensitivity.
Yes, you know,
the chops and the acting chops, you know, and he could fight, you know, and whereas Connery, like, he, you know, I think it's that whole line that Eva Green says to Daniel Craig, you think of women as disposable pleasures. And that's kind of how I see Connery.
Right.
Like, I can't see, you know, there was never anything in any of the movies, but you never believed he really, truly cared about any of those women that he was with ever.
I agree with you 100%. And I think that's what would have made it different, or what would have really hit is if he had been able to make that turn and basically reveal another side of his Bond 6 movies in.
Yeah, but look at when Ilsa Bunt is chasing them through the ice capades, you know, in Switzerland, and you know, George Lazenby is like genuinely frightened. You know, if it was Connery, you'd be like, he's scared of 6 guys in orange ski parkers and an overweight, you know, a 70-year-old woman. You know, it's like Connery, you would expect to turn around and fucking take them all out, right? Yeah. George Lazenby's like hiding, you know, he's scared and he needs Diana Rigg to come and rescue him, right?
Yeah.
I don't think Connery would need that, or you would believe it if it was portrayed that way.
Right. So speaking of Spy Who Loved Me.
Yeah, we got off that track.
Well, I can't help myself. It's talking to you and finally being able to talk to somebody that is so knowledgeable about all this stuff and dig this deep is just, I couldn't help myself. It sounds as though Sonia couldn't help herself. But Sonia.
Yes.
Now that two men have spent 75% of this podcast yammering on about the greatness of James Bond.
I do like James Bond. I resent that you keep saying that I don't like James Bond.
I'm not saying that. I want to give you your chance to speak. I'm feeling guilty about blabbing so much for once.
No, you're totally fine. You have not been on the show in weeks, so it's totally fine. I did want to ask, though, as we're talking about like recasting different Bonds, do you have any preference of who you think should be the next Bond? I'm asking Mark, by the way, not you, Smith.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I don't care what you think.
Who do I think should be the next Bond? Well, okay, so let's this is the conversation that's on everyone's lips, right? Because clearly this is Daniel Craig's last movie, right? We all know that. So here's the thing. I love the Idris Elba idea, but this is the problem. There's no way it's going to be Idris Elba because he's too old, and they're not hiring somebody who can't do 4 more movies, 5 more movies. It's just not going to happen. So I
also love the Idris Elba idea, but I do suggest him for pretty much every movie.
Yeah, no, he's great. And I can't believe all the big franchises he does. What's he do? He does Star Trek in a bad Halloween mask.
Yeah.
My God, that's how you use Idris Elba?
Yeah, you take the most handsome man on the planet and cover him in 5 hours of makeup. Is awesome.
And give him like something that basically a character actor from Bad Dinner Theater could have done.
Hey, I could have been in a Star Trek movie.
That's really funny. But I will say that, I just don't think he's a realistic option because, they're casting, they're going to cast somebody that, they don't want to be in a situation where, 2 films from now or 1 film from now, they got to recast. So, and you don't want Idris Elba in A View to a Kill. So
he's like 48 or something, right?
Yeah, but really, and plus the physical demands of this role. You don't want it to be, Roger Moore, where he's in it for 20 minutes and the stuntman is in it for 2 hours. So I think that sort of takes him off the table. And who's that leave? It's like there's a lot of talk about Henry Cavill. Not an awful idea. I actually love the idea of Tom Hiddleston, and I'll tell you why. Because to me, Tom Hiddleston is the more Bond, and I think no one can be better than Daniel Craig as the Connery Bond. Like I feel like Daniel Craig nailed the Sean Connery Bond, like the dark, brooding, just tough, and I feel like they're always. What's great is when you go from one extreme to the other rather than try and be a pale imitation. Like to me, Dalton and Lazenby were just an imitation of Connery.
Right.
Whereas Moore was something completely different, and it was refreshing because he wasn't trying to be Connery. So I feel like what I love about Tom Hiddleston is he wouldn't try to be Daniel Craig. He would be his own thing. And I just think it's such a different way to go. It's that kind of, upper crust English, thing. So that's interesting to me. Look, I wouldn't be upset if it's Henry Cavill. I would love it if they would discover somebody we've never heard of before. I mean, I'm the first to admit I thought that Daniel Craig was a terrible idea until I saw Casino Royale. I mean, I loved him in Munich, but I thought he was awful in Tomb Raider. I didn't really think the guy in Road to Perdition, as good as he was my idea of James Bond. So, but I was 100% wrong. I mean, he's freaking amazing.
Yeah.
Was Henry Cavill in The Man from U.N.C.L.E.?
Yes.
He was. Yeah.
I didn't see that, and people speak pretty highly of it.
Yeah.
Now they do. Where were they when it came out?
Right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I love the idea of Henry Cavill, but he seems too... Maybe I've seen too much of Superman with the shirt off. He just seems way too big and buff. Like, one of my favorite action sequences in recent years was Dave Bautista beating the living shit out of Daniel Craig on the train in Spectre. And the fear to see Craig's Bond go from cocky ass kicker, punching through walls to desperately running away is great. And I cannot imagine Henry Cavill being that desperate to run away. And actually, now that I think about it, to talk about The Spy Who Loved Me, watching Jaws throw Roger Moore around and that gigantic dinner plate hand just covering Moore's face is just, seeing Cavill in that position, I always want to feel like the right henchman could really kick the living shit out of James Bond, and I'm not even sure there's a person alive that I can imagine.
Look, that's a good point. You see that in Fallout and Mission Impossible. He's just a force of nature, and I think you're right. I mean, I think it's true. He's who's really going to be physically threatening or intimidating to Henry Cavill? I mean, especially because in the back of our minds, we all see him as Superman, so that even complicates it even more.
Right.
So yeah, that's a really good point.
So I want to throw an idea by you that I think is too. I think he's also too old. I looked at this.
Patrick Stewart? No, I don't see it.
Ewan McGregor, I think, would be an insanely good Bond. An insanely fun Bond.
Great Bond villain.
That too, yes. But let's. Oh shoot, there was Ewan McGregor. Oh well, actually, let me ask you this about Thomas Hiddleston, because I kind of had the same feeling that you did, that it would be a completely different way. After, I guess, The Night Manager, there were a lot of people talking about him being...
Yeah, it was practically an audition.
Right.
It was practically an audition for Bond.
And wasn't he great? I love The Night Manager.
No, I loved it too.
So
it was really, really good.
Okay, so I could be completely wrong because I have not seen that yet. It's one of the things I want to get to. But when I saw him in like the first 20 minutes, first 30 minutes of Kong Skull Island, and he's playing this adventuring rogue guy...
Right.
Oh my God, I couldn't. It's like, no, I will never be able to buy this guy as James Bond.
No, but that was he was you got to look at him in Night Manager, because he's great in Night Manager. Forget trying to erase your memories of Skull Island.
Well, that's true.
Well, actually, now that we're talking about Night Manager, I'm thinking maybe Hugh Laurie should play Bond.
I don't know. Again, a Bond villain. Bond villain.
A little too old.
Bond villain. Bond. I could see him. He was a great villain in Night Manager too. So.
All right. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mark.
No, I was coming in for a landing there.
Okay, well, is there anything else? Thank you so much for coming on to somewhat talk about The Spy Who Loved Me and everything.
We talked about it.
We did, yeah.
We did. I mean, the thing is, if somebody's listening and they've never seen The Spy Who Loved Me, they should go out and rent it, or on Apple TV. Actually, this was a wonderful thing. It upgraded all my Bond movies to 4K, which is not even available on 4K Blu-ray. But if you have them, you buy them digitally. Apple TV Ultimate, and those movies look amazing because about 10 years ago they did the Lowry restorations, right? So they look amazing in 4K. So it's it's worth getting all the Bond movies and because for me it's I watch them quite a bit. Actually, I really enjoy going back to the Bond movies and even the bad ones,
right.
And just watching them, and there's something great. Even the worst Bond movie is better than most things, and I don't mean it in terms of being a quality movie, but just the enjoyment factor. They're
always entertaining.
They're always entertaining. Yeah, exactly. So, I think that's great. But yeah, we talked about Spy Who Loved Me.
That's true.
I love that. I love that. I adore that movie. And as I said, it's my third favorite movie of 1977. Although I don't know, Close Encounters is pretty awesome. So
that's
maybe
true.
it's my fourth favorite movie of 1977.
That's true.
But I don't know. You have to, I have to think about this. I'll have to get back to you on this one.
All right.
Smith,
well, we will.
Smith, do you still have all of them on VHS?
I do not. I have some of
the
them.
Pink Panther cartoons at the beginning, which is the most ridiculous thing ever. It's
Smith and I were roommates in college, and he owned all of them on.
Oh, I forgot about that.
He owned them all on VHS, and whenever our cable went out, which was often because I wouldn't pay the bill, we would end up watching
lots
James
of
Bond
movies. Right.
Well, and Pink Panther cartoons.
That's right. That's right.
Now, I miss the days. It's like they used to have. They would come out with the VHS, and it was just all the trailers of the Bond movies, and I would watch those things. I mean, that's how starved for content we were back in the day. But
these kids don't have any idea how good they
have no idea how good they have it. But having every movie and TV show available at the touch of a button.
I know, crazy.
It's crazy.
It's crazy.
And that's part of why we, started doing 430 movie, because it was sort of to call attention to some of the more obscure movies, in addition to sort of the obvious things. Like we're recording a couple new episodes tomorrow, and it's like one of them Spielberg week, and we were talking about like, is that too mainstream? And it was kind of like, well, you know what? Let's make it anything he's directed, anything he's produced, anything he's acted in. So like we can actually go for the deep cuts and not just go for the usual suspects,
Right.
And that's part of the fun of the show. And even with Bond Week, it was kind of like, how do we, and I was sort of arguing for like Casino Royale 67 just to throw a curveball in there, but nobody agreed with me.
That's a hell of a curve.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show. I am a huge fan of everything you've done. Hopefully we'll have you on again at some point in the future.
Yeah, and I would say if you're a Battlestar Galactica fan, please, you can get the new book, So Say We All, is available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you buy books or Kindles. But if you're looking for the audiobook, you're going to have to read it to yourself. Because
I will. I promise.
And then, please check out the 430 movie at 430movie.com or at Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Wherever you listen to this fine podcast, you can get the 430 movie and hopefully get a kick out of it, because we're having a lot of fun doing it, and it's really been taking off, which is nice to see sort of retention and people come back week after week. I never thought I'd find myself doing a podcast, but I've been enjoying it thoroughly. It's a good group of people.
It's really fun.
Yeah,
it's fun.
Where can people find you on Twitter?
They can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Mark A. Altman. And also they can follow us at 430 Podcast, 430 Movie Podcast, without the colon, 430 Movie Podcast, or follow me personally on Twitter and Instagram at Mark A. Altman. Although I rarely post on Instagram because I don't like taking pictures and posting them, and I'd rather write snarky things on Twitter.
I hear you.
You know what that's like.
Same.
So.
But yeah, no, it's always great being on the show, and I'm so glad we got to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is of course James Bond. So, I'm sort of talked out Battlestar Galactica because it was the 40th anniversary, and everyone wanted to talk about the 40th anniversary. And I'm going to New York Comic Con next week, and I got a bunch of panels which is great, but I'm talked out. No more. It was like sort of when I got to the end of the Star Trek tour, it's like, God, do I have to talk about Star Trek, or can we talk about something else? Because I'm done talking about Star Trek. And it's sort of how I'm getting about Galactica now. So to talk about James Bond is actually a nice change of pace, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, no problem.
You are welcome. You can come back anytime and talk about anything you want.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. And thanks for the support of the books and everything else. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. We love these like crazy. So anything we can do, I mean, it's I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting to the age where I've seen so much, I've read so much. It's harder to kind of really blow my skirt up or whatever. But anything you do is anything you do, Mark, blows my skirt up.
Ed Gross, Ed Gross deserves the lion's share of the credit. I mean, he is one of the last real entertainment journalists still in the business. A lot of people are filing stories from their parents' basement, and they're just super fans and have no credibility. Ed Gross has been doing this for a long time. I mean, I met him because he was writing for Starlog. I was writing for Cinefantastic. He called me up when I was in college, I think, to see if he could use some of an article I'd written, and we've been friendly ever since. And having the opportunity to do all these books with him has really been super fun. He's just he's a real talent, a great guy, and I'm sure he'll be doing this long after I'm done, and I will always read whatever he writes because he's awesome.
100%. All right, I think I'm all talked out. Believe it or not, Sonia.
What? That sounds like a lie.
We're done dorking out.
That's right.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. Thanks, buddy.
Okay, good night. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Mark.
Bye. Thanks.